As we all know, ninjas are mammals. They enjoy wailing on their awesome guitars and, of course, when they have to, shoot the occasional blast of bio-slime. But when it comes to video games, there's one particular ninja that stands above the rest, and that is Joe Musashi. In the late 80s, Ninja Mania was sweeping most of the world across cineplexes, comic books, and video stores, and Sega was quick to capitalize on this white-hot trend with what has arguably become the grandfather of ninjutsu-based video games, Shinobi. With various sequels, spin-offs, reboots, and reimaginings, there's plenty to cover. So let's delve into all those shadowy corners, the dastardly villains, exotic locales, and various ninpo powers, and explore what makes this franchise so legendary. So with that said, I present to you the video game history of Shinobi. Before we slice into the shadows though, if you've been living under a rock for the last year, you might have missed the fact that Sega and Lizard Cube have just released a brand new Joe Musashi adventure with Shinobi Art of Vengeance. This stunning hand-animated entry draws upon the entire franchise for its visuals, gameplay, and music, which features new compositions by T. Lopes and someone who knows a little bit about ninja action games, Yuzo Koshiro. In Art of Vengeance, Joe is seeking to take down the evil Lord Ruse and his band of demonic generals, and has to do so by exploring and conquering over a dozen action-packed stages filled with secrets, collectibles, and devious traps. Fortunately, Joe has a massive selection of special moves, ninja tools, and buff-giving amulets at his disposal, plus a wide array of combo attacks that let you stylishly slay your enemies, including the deadly power of Shinobi executions. Art of Vengeance is out now on PS4, 5, Nintendo Switch, Steam, Xbox One, and the Xbox Series line, and truly demonstrates that you just can't keep a good ninja down. Thanks again to Sega for sponsoring today's video, and now, without further ado, let's enter the dojo of the Oboro clan. (1987) is often considered one of the most important years in video game history, as it saw the release of many titles that would go on to become industry juggernauts. Final Fantasy, Metal Gear, Street Fighter, Mega Man, Double Dragon, and yes, Shinobi as well. While having obvious parallels to Namco's Rolling Thunder, which released the previous year, Sega made sure that Shinobi would stand out with its detailed graphics, large sprites, and with the obvious appeal that ninjas were enjoying in the late 80s, which made it an arcade smash hit that year and a success that easily rolled over into 1988 as well. There is a bit of contention on which ninja game was released first in Japanese game centers, Shinobi or Ninja Warriors, as they were both credited as being released in the last 2 months of the year, but even though they were both quality titles, Shinobi was considered the runaway hit of the two.
A revolution broke out, and everything came to an end.
The story setup was typical of the age, an evil but a vague paramilitary organization called Zeed, not to be confused with Snood,
next time,
kidnapped a bunch of kids from Musashi's ninja clan, and it was up to Joe to get them back, a plot Sega would recycle for other unrelated titles.
Michael!
Now, despite him appearing completely unmasked, not very stealthy there, I gotta say, Joe had to save every kid to trigger each level exit, and needed to jump between the lower and upper sections to avoid enemy attacks, as they all had the ability to one-shot him. Fortunately, his unlimited kunai, close-range sword swipe, and ninja magic or ninpo were more than sufficient to help him defeat the boss of Zeed, who turned out to be, dun dun dun, his former mentor Nakahara. If this sounds like a common action movie or video game trope, don't worry, because it is. Shinobi was ported to almost every home format that was available at the time, with the most notable version being for the Sega Master System, which was more of a custom tailor-made affair that made some smart changes that were more in line with the home market. Some of these included a full life bar, making hostage rescues optional, screw them kids I guess, as well as redesigning how power-ups and upgrades were awarded. Most interesting of all, though, is that even though Shinobi was a 100% Sega-owned IP, it found its way onto the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1989 via the unlicensed Masters over at Tengen. This was pretty close to what was seen on the Master System, but saw further changes like the removal of the sword strike and downgrades in graphics and sound, with Joe now looking more like a generic army guy than a ninja. As stated before, Shinobi was an early smash hit for Sega's coin-op division, and Joe became a household name overnight, so a variety of follow-ups were greenlit pretty much immediately, which included a full-on arcade sequel. 1989's Shadow Dancer, bafflingly dropping the Shinobi name entirely, which would lead to a lot of confusion later on, was an iterative sequel in many ways, but still made some subtle and important changes that would impact much of the series. Joe, we assume, is just minding his own business, walking through an unnamed metropolis with his faithful dog, when random terrorists start terrorizing, which included planting bombs throughout the entire city. Hostages were therefore replaced with bombs this time around, and must be disarmed before exiting the stage, but thankfully Joe is not alone in this explosive situation, as he could now sick his ninja pupper on his enemies, but that did come with a few caveats. Pressing down an attack would send the dog against the nearest enemy to stun them, but if you took too long to finish them off, our canine friend could take a hit, which would de-evolve him into a puppy, I think. It's pretty bizarre, but once you got used to this system, it would become second nature to sick the dog against threats on the lower floor while taking care of the top, dropping down on the temporarily incapacitated baddies. The graphics obviously saw a glow up, as well as Joe's ninja garb becoming the iconic white variant we all know today. That is, if you believe this is in fact Joe Musashi. The original arcade game doesn't actually name the ninja. The Genesis home port simply calls him Shinobi, in-game at least, and the instruction manuals and print ads for all the other versions didn't help untangle this web either, as they all name him something different. On the rather choppy and awkwardly controlling Master System version, he was named both Fuma and Takashi, and in the instruction manuals that were produced by US Gold, he was identified as Joe, but of course, that's not exactly reliable. The general consensus, though, is that according to the original Japanese versions, you were actually controlling Joe's son, Hayate, a rather curious part of his genealogy that hadn't been mentioned before or since. Out of all the instruction manuals, though, it's the Genesis version, which was dubbed Shadow Dancer: The Secret of Shinobi, which attempts to clarify all of this nonsense, but even that's not exactly accurate. This is because it's not even a port of the arcade game, but essentially an all-new one with completely different enemies, levels, and a heavily revised plot. Here, they claim you are in fact Joe Musashi, and you're trying to avenge the death of your pupil Kaito, who entrusted the care of his dog Yamoto to you to take down some type of reptilian insectoid demon lord. The only real connective tissue between this and the arcade version is the aforementioned puppy partner, but even that has also seen a big change, in that you now need to hold down the attack button to fill a gauge, which ultimately gave you a bit more control of when you want him to attack. As you can see, Secret of Shinobi looks quite different, and so it's here where Sega saw what they had and where the franchise could go. While serving them well in the arcades, it was clear that simple action games were losing a bit of ground to beat-em-ups, and from here on out, Shinobi would exclusively transition to the home market. But that didn't mean the franchise would suffer for it. but in fact, it would only get better from here. Remember when I said Sega had commissioned several ninja-themed follow-up games after the success of the arcade original? Well, 1989 certainly exemplified that. Even though Shadow Dancer was the first sequel, it came to the Genesis in 1990. But before that, in 1989, Sega also developed Revenge of the Shinobi, which must have confused many gamers trying to keep track at the time. Revenge is considered more or less as a direct sequel to the original which started it all, and largely ignores the confusing events of Shadow Dancer, as the intro attract screen establishes that this takes place 3 years after Joe's original adventure, and sees a resurrected Zeed, this time Neo Zeed, attacking his clan and absconding with his bride-to-be Naoko. It's here where the franchise really started branching out and expanding in smart but sensible ways. Whereas the first 2 arcade games were very simple walk-to-the-right affairs, Revenge spiced things up by having plenty of larger levels that required some exploring. Joe now needed to flip switches, avoid traps, and search for additional power-ups, which was made far easier by his expanded moveset, where he was no longer contained to just jumping between the lower and higher half, but now had free reign to go wherever thanks to his new jumping abilities. Combat options were increased as well, including a kicking crouch attack, fanning out multiple kunai in one shot, and a few different sword slashes which would cut down most enemies in a flash. Ninpos were now selectable by pausing the game and activating the power you wanted, which not only did the expected things like wiping out all enemies on screen, can now buff Joe with shields or increase his jumping power rather significantly. While the series had never been a slouch in the music department, the addition of Yuzo Koshiro really took the presentation to the next level, with many of his tunes contributing to a classic all-timer Genesis soundtrack. It's appropriate then that this synthy late 80s feel was accompanied by the most copyright-infringing 80s menagerie of bad guys, as Neo Zeed was not picky about who they added to their ranks. Some amongst these was Rambo, the Terminator, Spider-Man, Batman, and even our Lord and Savior, Godzilla. These inspirations didn't stick around forever though, as Revenge of Shinobi received 5 different revisions, with each one altering a boss in a move to lessen the likelihood of litigation. The Terminator oddly stayed the same throughout the game's life, as well as his brief period of turning into the Hulk, but Spider-Man has his own little mini history. The first version has a red and dark blue Spidey, but once Sega got the rights to publish Spider-Man games through Marvel, they changed the next revision to look even more accurate with a brighter blue color. But once that agreement ran its course, he was then changed into some weird pink monster thing. Now, once you defeated Pink Spider Guy Man, he then logically turns into Batman, which was hastily changed into more of a Bat Demon later on. Rambo had his hair removed in every subsequent release after the original. My heart goes out to you, buddy. While Godzilla surprisingly stuck around, unchanged until the last 2 revisions, where Sega actually made him cooler by swapping in with a giant dinosaur skeleton, avec a bunch of random organs sloshing around inside his ribcage. These bizarre bosses might be the most infamous thing classic Shinobi games are known for, and set a sort of precedent most gamers would expect from then on out. When you're playing as Joe, you should always expect the unexpected. Something that would also be unexpected is the next game in the series being a marked step down, and not even be for the Genesis, because 1990's The Cyber Shinobi, despite being a very cool name, is a Sega Master System stinker. This was not released outside Japan and Europe, so don't be surprised if you haven't heard of it, but but that might also be due to its quality. Here, you play as Joe Musashi's unnamed grandson, except he's not unnamed because he's also literally called Joe. Controlling a descendant does make sense though, as this takes place in the future and all, but it doesn't play futuristically because it's slow, clunky, and not very ninja-like. And while there's plenty of cool, futuristic 8-bit games out there like Street Fighter 2010, Power Blade, or Shatterhand, the Cyber Shinobi does nothing with the premise, as it really lacks imagination in both level design and enemies, as you mostly fight standard stuff like helicopters, trucks, and soldiers. Now, while I can't confirm this, I have a suspicion that Sega might have contra-forced this particular game, meaning it started off as something completely different, then got the Shinobi name slapped onto it shortly before release. It's just got that certain smell about it. Fortunately, that would be the last Master System-only adventure that Joe or anybody in his extended family would have, as the Genesis would play host to what some would consider his greatest triumph, 1993's Shinobi III: Return of the Ninja Master. This expanded upon the style first seen in Revenge, but polished it to a mirror sheen, retaining the fast ninja action while upping the combat mechanics, the presentation, level complexity, just about everything. Joe could now run only as a ninja could, use his sword more freely, perform a helpful dive kick that allowed him to bounce between enemies, and of course new Ninpo powers. Since this came out several years after Revenge, it also took full advantage of the Genesis hardware, featuring tons of impressive parallax scrolling throughout and sporting some very detailed sprites, which are highlighted in several of the new bosses. Sega also saw fit to add various new set pieces intended to heighten the excitement, like fighting while falling down or up a canyon using chunks of debris, a chase on a horseback during a stormy night, and probably the most radical of the bunch, shredding the waves on a rocket-powered surfboard. And while the copyright-infringing bosses were certainly lessened this time around, that DNA was not completely lost, as evidenced by the appearance of just straight-up Mecha Godzilla. Ha! A game after my own heart. Aside from its tight, fluid gameplay and sublime presentation, Shinobi 3 is also well known for its delays, as it took almost 4 years to come out after the debut of Revenge. In 1992, it seemed like it was fully complete, as it was previewed in several magazines back in the day, which all claimed that its release was imminent. But then, the project went dark for the guts of a year before finally turning up on store shelves in 1993, and fortunately, it was more than worth the wait. Reportedly, the development team felt more refinements were needed for Shinobi 3 after an internal review, and thus some levels were completely cut while new ones were added in, along with further improvements in the graphics and animation and the new chase sequences. Not only are there surviving screenshots of these earlier versions, but some are even playable to this day, which gives a fascinating insight into 2D action game development. Yuzo Koshiro sadly didn't return for this entry, he would have been busy with Streets of Rage at the time, but fortunately, Return of the Ninja Master still has a stellar soundtrack. Back when I was a wee one, I had visited a Genesis-owning friend and distinctly recall hearing the evocative and catchy ninja tunes that typify the franchise. So, if anything, you can always rely on Shinobi for two things: crazy bosses and great music. Return of the Ninja Master established a new benchmark for the series and is often considered one of the best games available on the Genesis, but even with all these accolades, Sega didn't seem to know how best to utilize the franchise as it moved into the next generation of consoles. Before we get there though, I would be remiss if I didn't spend at least a little time talking about Shinobi on the go. Even though much like the woeful Cyber variation that was made exclusively for the Master System, Shinobi for the Game Gear, sometimes known as GG Shinobi, is thankfully a much better and more authentic ninja experience. In it, you actually save and then control different color-coded ninjas from Joe's clan, as each one has a speciality which helps you navigate each level, like a grappling hook, throwing bombs, energy blasts, etc. You can switch to each ninja on the fly once you've saved them by just pausing the action when their abilities are needed, which was a pretty forward-thinking feature for the Game Gear in 1991. There's not much story here per se, as it is a handheld game, but the gist is that after sending out some scouts into some place called the Neo City, Joe becomes concerned after not hearing back for a while, hence the old "if you want to do something right, you better do it yourself" adage. He then makes for Neo City to save his fellow ninjas and take out some vague new evil. A sequel followed just a year later, confusingly called Shinobi II: The Silent Fury, making it the only game, in the West at least, that is actually called Shinobi 2. Not much to say about this one, as it's more of the same, complete with the ninja swapping, as the only real difference is having to locate crystals that are hidden in each level, which require the use of a specific ninja's unique skill to collect. It once again took place in Neo City, and once again has a paper-thin plot, with Joe having to take on a new evil group called the Techno Warriors, led by a mysterious black-clad ninja called the Black Ninja. Returning back to consoles, and as I stated earlier, after Return of the Ninja Master was released, Sega struggled and in many instances failed to adapt many of their big franchises for the Saturn, like Sonic, Streets of Rage, or Echo. And while Shinobi was better represented than those examples, it wasn't exactly what fans were anticipating. Released in 1995 and dubbed Shin Shinobi Den in Japan, Shinobi Legions in the US, and Shinobi X in Europe, this release did navigate the sometimes difficult transition of going 3D by not doing it at all. It retained the same 2D side-scrolling action from before, but utilized one of the more common gimmicks typical of CD-based hardware at the time, which was the glorious concept of FMV sequences. Live actors were dressed up and proceeded to run around dark rooms filled with boxes and plenty of green screens, which constituted pretty much the entire story, which, in a disappointment to many, had been entirely rebooted. Joe Musashi was MIA, and in his place was a new protag, Sho, who gets embroiled in a very cookie-cutter plot to save his sister Aya from his rival, the dastardly Kazuma. While the gameplay is similar to Shinobi 3, Legions doesn't feel quite as refined or as fluid, as the characters were created via Mortal Kombat-style digitization, so there's an inherent stiffness to their movements. Still though, all the moves were there, including some impressive new Nimpo attacks and a big increase in the violence, as enemies would regularly get bisected by a quick sword slash. Now, while having aged worse than the gorgeous pixel art of Revenge or Returns, I will say, considering that much of the game is all digitized, including many of the stage assets, it doesn't look as bad as you'd initially think. This is mostly helped by the environmental diversity that's on display. Bamboo forests, castles, mountain cliffs, caves, underground labs. In fact, one of the only few true letdowns in the presentation are the bosses. Since so much of the game relies on costume actors, that's mostly all you get, save for one or two outliers in level 3. Here you are accosted by a number of lab-grown creatures, which culminates in a giant pissed-off dinosaur and then some weird gargoyle-ish computer-generated nightmare. The only other thing of note for Shinobi Legions is the soundtrack, which is fine in and of itself, but it's a noticeable step down in terms of quality when compared to the last two games. That is, of course, in relation to the Japanese and North American versions, as the European disc featured a newly recorded OST and is far more atmospheric and memorable than what was heard in the rest of the world. Something most Shinobi aficionados can agree on.
I fucking love this music.
So, while certainly a serviceable entry overall, Shinobi X/Legions/whatever didn't score nearly as high as the last two entries with most video game magazines of the day, and sadly represented the last title in the franchise for the remainder of the 1990s. Sega's AM1 team, which included many Shinobi staffers, was eventually consolidated with a few others to be reformed as Overworks/WoW, who developed a variety of titles, including various sports games, a few puzzlers, and the criminally underutilized Skies of Arcadia. During this time, Overworks did start development on a new 3D Shinobi for the Dreamcast, wanting to emphasize fast action and a steep difficulty curve. Unfortunately though, work began slightly too late, as by the time the project was greenlit in early 2001, the Dreamcast was already being discontinued, with Sega making their famous move into third-party publishing. Fortunately though, the project was not cancelled, it was simply moved onto a competitor's machine, eventually becoming the simply titled Shinobi, which slashed onto the PS Double Ballin' in 2002. It was truly a game that emphasized what was popular at the time in terms of mechanics: wall running, zippy dash-based movement, an emphasis on combos and special moves, and quickly dispatching enemies via a new execution system called Tate. Story-wise though, this is sadly another soft reboot, focusing on a new ninja named Hatsuma who has to infiltrate a giant magical golden palace and take on a mysterious sorcerer that dwells within, while also contending with the appearance of his brother and rival Moritsune. Shinobi 2002 asked a lot of the player, as the game got increasingly difficult with a huge uptick in enemies and their attacks, causing the player to always be on their toes and have to memorize every move at Hatsuma's disposal, as all the buttons on the DualShock 2 were used in the heat of combat. But after a lot of practice, an immensely rewarding game would then reveal itself, giving the player so many fun movement and attack options that, while being far more complex than the original 2D games, really made you feel like a ninja badass. On top of all that, Overworks made sure not to completely forget the series' roots. While he's not mentioned anywhere in the story, Joe Musashi can be unlocked as a playable character if you collected a number of Oboro clan coins, which also goes for Moritsune and a variety of other extra options like new difficulty levels and even ninja VR missions. Now, while Joe is clearly just an extra skin on top of Hatsuma's model, he actually plays a little differently, having unique stats like his shurikens being unlimited and his main attack not causing any life drain, although he had a few drawbacks too. Shinobi for the PS2 reviewed quite positively, and was a perfect example of a hardcore 2D action game successfully making the jump to the world of texture maps and polygons, with the only real criticisms being its punishing difficulty level that probably scared away a number of more casual fans. Unfortunately, though, 2002 wasn't a perfect year for ninja games though, as Shinobi had one other really embarrassing release, the confusingly titled The Revenge of the Shinobi for the Game Boy Advance. This Drek was sub-licensed from Sega to THQ, who then contracted someone nobody had ever heard of, 3D6 Games, to develop a limp, smaller-than-life return to 2D action for the series. In this, you played as a generic ninja simply named Shinobi this time, regardless of what country you played the game in, whereupon you then had to repetitively scour interiors for several keys without much in the way of, exciting set pieces or bosses. Story-wise, Default Ninja number 2 needs to take down a warlord named Ashira O and collect some elemental swords or something. I don't care. This got roasted in reviews of the time, was ugly as all hell, was slow and clunky, and is therefore deservingly forgotten about by most. Against all odds and logic though, 3D6 also somehow got the green light to perform the same treatment for Altered Beast, which truly represented a dark time for many fans of older Sega properties. Meanwhile, Overworks, encouraged by the warm response to their first PS2 effort, immediately launched into development on a sequel, which released just 1 year later. And while not a bad game by any measure, this follow-up, dubbed Nightshade,
Night fucking shade!
no, not that one, didn't quite hit the mark for a good percentage of fans. This follows another new ninja, or kunoichi, named Hibana, an employee of the Nakatomi Corporation who's been tasked to seal away an invading force of hell-spawned demons, while collecting the shattered pieces of Hatsuma's cursed sword from the last game. Despite the more futuristic setting, the gameplay is largely the same, with the Tate system being expanded into the air to better fit Hibana's more aerial-focused combat style, where she dashes between enemies, rarely touching the ground. This gave Nightshade a slightly more Devil May Cry feel, but at the end of the day it still felt largely similar to Hatsuma's adventure. Speaking of Hatsuma though, if players had a save from his game on their memory card, he'd unlock as an extra character, but you'd have to have needed to finish his game at least once to meet the criteria to do so. He also plays exactly like he did before, as he can't take advantage of Hibana's new attack options, which also goes for Joe, who unlocks after defeating a set number of stages. Reviews were far more divisive for Nightshade, with plenty of outlets already growing tired of the gameplay loop and criticizing the added emphasis on defeating wave after wave of enemies in largely the same fashion, without much in the way of innovation. So it's perhaps this reception or the complete dissolution of Overworks which led to one of the bigger hiatuses in the franchise's history, as it took 8 more years for Shinobi to return once again. It took many by surprise when Sega announced that ninja action was returning to the video game world, and specifically in the stereoscopic 3D world of the Nintendo 3DS in 2011, with another game that was once again simply called Shinobi. If you happen to be counting, this is the 4th game that happened to do this. Since Sega had lost many of their OG staffers over the years, the reins of development of this new title were handed over to Kryptonite Games, who by that time had built up a solid body of work of various handheld superhero and Assassin's Creed titles. Engaging combat and speedy gameplay were some of the common threads you saw throughout most of their back catalog, and so Kryptonite combined that with a lot of influence from Shinobi III, which made for an underrated and underplayed entry in the series. Story-wise, this is probably the craziest one, as you actually play as Joe's grandfather, Jiro, who gets flung into the future and into a world where Zeed controls everything with an iron fist. Something that is explained, although haphazardly, through comic book style cutscenes. And if you think that story explanation was a bit too normal, a bit too milquetoast, don't worry, cause aliens get involved too. Jiro can perform a wide variety of attacks and can unleash various new ninpo, but now also comes equipped with a grappling chain which lets him reach new areas and to avoid enemy attacks. Bosses and enemy placements can get pretty tough, but thankfully there are multiple difficulty levels to get you used to the ebb and flow of the game, although the lower difficulties do lock you out from experiencing some of the later story events. Where Shinobi 3DS really impresses though is in its level design and set pieces, as Jiro will need to dodge fire from a long-distance submarine, fight on the back of a supersonic jet, jump between trucks on a highway, and face off against some truly wild bosses. None more Shinobi than a giant mecha megalodon. While reviews of the day criticized its difficulty and its scattershot cutscenes, per my experience, the only real negative with this one is the 3DS hardware itself, as the stereoscopic visuals have caused an unfortunate side effect. Even if you turn the 3D slider off, Shinobi's visuals still retain a pretty glaring ghosting effect, especially on Jiro. which can often be distracting in the midst of dodging a bunch of projectiles or fighting bosses. This is alleviated somewhat by playing it in 3D, but you then have to play the whole thing like that. The other annoying thing about being on the 3DS is that this is one of the few games on the system that does not emulate very well. All of this mars what is otherwise a stellar entry in the series, and it's a shame it was never ported to any other platform for others to experience its rewarding gameplay and over-the-top spectacle. Okay, so while that covers all of the main games, of course I can't forget the other places where Joe or Shinobi or Hayate or whoever has popped up over the decades. While I'm not a huge fan of Alex Kidd, I gotta give big ups to Alex Kidd in Shinobi World, as who amongst us has never dreamt of finding themselves smack dab in the middle of a ninja fantasy. Joe then found himself in Sonic All-Stars Racing Transformed back in 2012, where he got behind the wheel of an ATV, I think? Not sure why this wasn't like the rocket surfboard from Shinobi 3, but I digress. Because it was just really nice to see him included alongside other Sega royalty like Danica Patrick and Yogscast. Now, I'm always reluctant to talk about mobile slop in videos like this, but a character like Joe takes what he can get. So, with that in mind, here's the mobile slop! In 2009, Shinobi received a remake on Java-based phones that bafflingly used Hatsuma's design with a slightly tweaked face. So in actuality, this is supposed to be Joe. That's like a Devil May Cry mobile game using Nero as the main character, but then calling him Dante. Anyway, it's a slow, low-impact affair where you once again have to save hostages to progress. And when I say hostages, I mean dozens upon dozens of my Shiranuis. That's kind of awesome, actually. What's less awesome is Sega Heroes, a gem-matching piece of malicious monetization from 2018 where you pick some characters, match gems, and get pressured into spending money. I'm aware of what I said earlier about Joe taking whatever jobs he can get, but I'm pretty sure his moral ninja code would be passionately against appearing in such a sad affair. And of course, I can't forget about Hatsuma and Hibana's playable appearances in Project X Zone 2, a nice addition alongside other famous ninjas as Strider Hiryu and Kagemaru. Now, there is one more game where the legend of Joe Musashi is continuing on, and that's Shinobi Art of Vengeance. And while I won't be going into details here due to how new the game is, if you'd like to see me play through the opening hours, ninja run on over to my second gameplay channel to check it out. What I can say for sure though is, it was absolutely worth the 14-year wait since Shinobi 3DS, and is a strong contender for my personal game of the year so far. You know, it's really quite amazing that for a franchise that's 38 years old, it's been able to stay relevant with very few releases over the decades merely through its mysterious characters, tightly designed gameplay, evocative music, and through the everlasting coolness that is the ninja. So I'd reckon in another 10 to 20 years in the future, we'll still be seeing Joe or Hatsuma or Shinobi stepping out of the shadows once again. But until that time comes, I just want to say I hope you really enjoyed this retrospective, and feel free to shout out your Shinobi memories in the comments below, or over on my social media. I'm McMuscles, and I'll see you next time, fellow ninjas.